Moving right along here in Camille Paglia's Sexual Personae, um, the first chapter is called Sex and Violence, or Nature and Art. And she opens this text by saying that in the beginning there was nature. Nature for her is primary, it is fundamental, it is absolute. And she does not see nature through the eyes of a romantic or a liberal or any of the descendants of Rousseau. Rousseau takes this idea, which she refutes, that it is society that corrupts and that human beings are born pure, thus rejecting original sin. She turns it the other way around and says she's coming out of the Sadian tradition, and Sade is based on a corrective, a satirical corrective to Rousseau, that human beings are innately cruel and aggressive by their nature, and that society exists primarily to protect us from each other and to keep in check these, what she calls chthonic or Dionysian impulses of aggression and cruelty that is the natural lot of men. So civilization is absolutely necessary. She doesn't sentimentalize nature at all. So for her, nature is the primary thing. It was there in the beginning, and she sees civilization, especially Western civilization, as an attempt to build a bulwark against it, to create an edifice that keeps nature out. And in the West, women have tended to be identified with nature. In fact, she says all through prehistory, women have been identified with nature. There's nothing new about that. The cults of the Great Mother go way back into the Paleolithic. They predominate all through the Neolithic. And people forget in their sentimentalizing of the Great Mother that every Great Mother comes with her a devouring mother. For every great goddess, for every Sibylle, let's say, you get a Kali, the devourer, the dark mother. And it was around the cult of Kali in India that there was a cult of human sacrifice and bloodthirstiness. Heads were ritually chopped off. The British were the ones who put a stop to this. So people tend to forget. Coatlicue is the great dark mother in Aztec civilization to whom hearts were sacrificed. She lived off of human blood and hearts. People forget this when they sentimentalize the cult of the Great Mother, because the mother is nature, and nature is furious. It's grotesque. It's misshapen, it's random, chaotic, and wild. Or at least this is the way she's portraying it in this book. So she says it's significant that the last society in the West to worship goddesses were the Minoan Crete. And she said, whatever the reasons that it fell, it never rose again. And what took its place, what we inherited, was the Mycenaean warrior culture that was handed down to us through Homer, intermixed with the Dorians. Both were Indo-Aryan, and this is really what she calls the shift in civilization here, which she sees as an evolutionary advance, as a higher, more developed kind of civilization. She calls it the sky cult, the masculine male sky cult, which overturned all the prehistoric earth cults that preceded them. And she sees this as an evolutionary advance. And indeed, I think if we look at the first and second generations of civilization, as Toynbee divided them into three generations ultimately, but the first generation of civilization is Sumer on the one hand and then Egypt on the other. So we have Sumer and Egypt coming into being as civilizations in which higher developed thinking in the form of philosophy, which is pure thinking with abstract concepts, the highest kind of thinking possible, did not really take place in those civilizations. There was no true philosophy. It was all religious, all religion-based. And goddesses did very well in those civilizations, as everyone knows. Isis is the great mother in Egypt, and Inanna, later Ishtar, is the great goddess in Sumer, although it must be said that Ishtar is Babylonian. Even though she corresponds, the Babylonians did not hold the goddess in quite as high a regard as the Sumerians did. The Sumerians were neither Semites nor Indo-Aryans. We don't know what they were. But the Babylonians were Semites, and the Semites also have traditionally, like the Indo-Aryans, been hostile to goddesses. So if we imagine what happened here with the first generation of civilization, these two ancient dying behemoths of Sumer on the one hand and Egypt on the other, in the second millennium BC, so we've got 2000 BC to 1000 BC, when we start getting massive invasions from nomads from the north, primarily Indo-Aryans, Indo-Europeans in the west, who become the Scandinavians and the Celts, and then the Greeks. And then in India, the Indo-Aryans become the Persians and the Hindus, the Vedic civilization. Early Indian civilization is very different from the later civilization. And then in China, not indo-aryans, but Mongols come raiding in, but nonetheless are equally nomadic and equally masculine dominant. Nomads don't have time for goddesses, and goddesses don't fare well in nomadic culture. If you look at the Rig Veda, which is the earliest text in India, which dates from something like 1500 BC, there are very few goddesses mentioned in it. And there's something like only 9 hymns, I think, to goddesses in a very large book filled with hymns to male sky gods. Nomads are always on the move. They don't have time to sit at the hearth. The woman dominates the hearth. The fire is the central pillar. You need a hearth and a chimney and an agrarian settled, situated civilization in order for the goddess to flourish. But the nomads are on the move. They require masculine strength, assertiveness, aggressiveness. A lot of strength is involved, and their whole way of life is based on impact, speed, the dromospheric realm that Paul Virilio identified as the realm of speed and impact, moving across the steppes with masculine power and male sky gods predominating amongst all of these nomadic peoples. Semites, too, coming up out of the south from the Syro-Arabian deserts, are also similarly nomadic and also similarly anti-goddess, more or less. So when these two groups of peoples come in from the north, Mongols and Indo-Aryan, Indo-Europeans from the north, and Semites from the south, they come in and sort of conquer, digest, and dissolve the first generation of civilization. The ancient behemoths of Egypt and Sumer, with their two satellite civilizations, Minoan Crete on the one hand, 2500 BC, and native Harappan Dravidian civilization in India, also 2500 BC, those all get ground up by these nomads, digested, swallowed up by this masculine male power. And indeed, I think there must be some relation between the motility of these societies and what later turns up in the creation of what Paglia calls the shift from earth cults to sky cults, with the creation of male transcendent philosophies, the ability to think in higher thought, the motility of speed of the mounted horseback warrior somehow gets translated through domesticity and intermixing and hybridization through creation of the motility of thought, the higher level thinking, which Camille Paglia says in this chapter is a creation of men. Men have a fear of nature, a fear of the slime and murk and ooze and cruelty of nature, which in the West is primarily identified with women. And so she says that Western civilization is based then on what she calls an Apollonian swerve away from the Thonian, the Chthonic. And the Chthonic is a word that she prefers, Jane Ellen Harrison's term for pre-Olympian religions. She prefers that to the use of the term Dionysian, because Dionysian tends to have positive connotations like, the joy of Dionysian power and creativity. For her, nature isn't like that. It's geologic. Chthonic means out of the earth, especially from out of the bowels of the earth, not the surface of the earth. It's geologic, it's dark, it's metamorphic, and it is the power of nature which is raw and cruel and rewards aggression and assertiveness, not passivity. So she goes through and characterizes this and says that tragedy has become the great Western genre because it is based on the attempt of the male to, even though it came out of the realm of Dionysus, the birth of tragedy, out of the Dionysian cult, as Nietzsche talks about in The Birth of Tragedy, nonetheless it ended by turning against them and overturning the Chthonian. Aeschylus's Oresteia is the great celebration of the Apollonian victory over the Chthonian, the dark matriarchal cults of the Furies, which are overturned by the rationalism of Athens and Athena and so forth. And she says, women don't fare well in tragedy. It's a male genre. The very structure of it, based on a sort of phallic rise and fall with a climax that Aristotle termed a peripteia, that climax is a Western invention. She says it does the climax, and it has a sexual analogy. It doesn't exist in the East, where the music just sort of, even their music just sort of, it doesn't develop. It just goes on and on, suddenly starts and then abruptly ends. And the same thing with their texts. They meander. A text like Journey to the West is a very long, rambling epic without much structure to it. They're very episodic. And so I think she's right about this, that the climax is an invention of the West. It comes in with tragedy, and she says rather that there are very few female protagonists in tragedy, And the ones that there are, characters like Euripides' Medea and Phaedra, generally tend to be obstacles and are represented as less moral than the men and obstacles to what the men are trying to correct. Woman introduces intolerable cruelty into tragedy, which is precisely the thing that the male tragedian is trying to correct and eliminate and get rid of. And so tragedy has become one of the West's greatest literary art forms. And then so she goes on then to characterize and say that she is an essentialist here, and she does believe that the association of women with nature is real and actual, not just a cultural convention. Women are closer to nature. They are nature, and they embody it in a way that men don't. Men represent culture and transcendence and the attempt and urge to get away from nature. The male has an urge and a fear to define himself in opposition from his mother and get away from his mother, get away from the feminine, lest he be devoured by it and fall right back into it again. I think she said Harold Bloom wrote on one of her papers, "Woman is born of woman, but man is born of woman and never recovers from that fact." It's a different psychology. It's totally different. Not only is the psychology different in the way that men define themselves and seek to identify themselves through differentiating themselves from female power, but the physiology is different too, naturally, of course, the physiology. But she says the physiology of men and women create different metaphors for how they go about doing things. Everything about male physiology is based on projection, aim. The male can see his genitals very clearly. They're evident. They're symmetrical. They're rational. The male phallus is rational. The female vagina is irrational and architecturally sloppy. Augustine said that woman is a temple built above a sewer. And so there's this identification of the female with the abyss, the dark maw, the gaping wound that has given birth to us, from whence we have come out, and that the man in particular really wants to get away from, but is yet tragically and ironically constantly drawn back through sexual desire to fall back into it. And she says that the toothed vagina works very well metaphorically, because the male is always less. What he leaves behind when he leaves the sex act, he's always depleted, diminished, and he's less than when he entered, what he has put in there. So there is a sense in which the female just sort of absorbs and steals and takes his energy, that is something that has to be constantly renewed. It's a constant male anxiety, this searching aim direction that is based on urination, for example. He says, she quotes Freud to the effect that Freud thought that primitive tribal man probably thought he was proud that he could of himself for putting out a fire by urinating on it, which is a strange thing to be proud of, she says, but yet women can't do that without getting burnt. So the male is based on projection. Ejaculation and urination require aim, focus, concentration, and it's the whole basis and physiology of the males. The male's whole physiology is built for aim, concentration, ramming, battering, raping, attacking. The whole physiology is built that way. Women's physiology is different. They're less prone to rape fantasies, for instance, she says, because they don't have the equipment for invading and opening another person's body. They're equipmentally not built for that. So she says the male metaphor then is aim, focus, and direction, but the female metaphor is mystery. The female analogy, the anatomy rather, is based on hiddenness. Everything is hidden. She can't even at first see her own genitals. Everything's hidden. Everything about her is hidden and is a mystery, and she sort of accepts that fact. The womb is something she can't see. There's always a limitation to what she can know, which she accepts, and she's better, more tolerable with ambiguities than men are. Men are obsessional, and they want transcendence, and they think they have this delusion, she says, that they can achieve objectivity, but they're never fully able to achieve it. So the physiologies determine the differences, and this characterizes everything about the way that men deal with women. It's always a mystery. Is that child really mine? What is the womb? What's in there? Did she have an orgasm? It's mystery, mystery, mystery. So it's a very different thing. The mystery characterizes woman, and she is the mystery that man tries to solve, that he's afraid of, and there's this constant attempt. She says rape, feminists make a mistake when they say that rape is an act, it's a crime of violence, masquerading as sex. She says, no, sex is power. It is a sex act. It is fundamentally a sex act, and is based on male power trying to overcome and conquer female power. So there's a power issue going on there. And she says that society isn't the cause of rape. Pornography isn't the cause of rape. It's society that defends women from being raped more often, which would occur every time a civilization or a society devolves. Rapes go on the rise. They increase. They're part of the natural programming of the male being as an aggressive being for the way he is. Rape is something that just springs out of him naturally. It's programmed and coded into him, even though, of course, it's any violation should be condemned just like any other violation of another civil rights, like murder or anything like that. She's not making an excuse for saying it's okay, but it is something that is there, and civilization keeps it in check and protects women from it. Women have risen to power, she says, precisely through patriarchal civilization. It is patriarchal civilization, industrialization, that has freed women and allowed them in the first place to make use of, by the Promethean law of capture and conflict, the male vocabulary, taking over the male conceptual apparatus and vying with him to produce works of equal greatness. There's a struggle there that's going on. But she says that women owe to men the creation of the very apparatus that they're using to try and transcend them. Civilization, she says, is a creation of men. She says every time she goes out and looks around at dams and bridges and buildings, it's a marvel. All these men, these were all created by men. Everything you look at. Female architects are, of course, somebody like Zaha Hadid is a marvelous female architect. But traditionally, this has all been the creation of men. And she says if civilization had been left up to women, we would all still be living in grass huts. This is one of the lines that she uses to conclude the essay. And I think there that she may be right. Women don't have the desire for conceptualization to achieve transcendence through conceptualization in a way that's a kind of a life and death thing, the way that it is for males. It's a life and death thing for a man to differentiate himself from the abyss, from the Chthonian realm of the dark undercurrents of nature and the goddess and the slimy ooze from whence we have all sprung, wet biology. The male is driven by a desire and an anxiety to attain transcendence through conceptualization in a way that isn't quite so necessary for women. They can do it if they want to, but they don't have to in quite the same way. She does say that women are, men become, although women now, of course, obviously have the option to become if they want to. But there's a struggle going on here between the sexes, and it's always been this way. It's not a new thing. And I think Paglia is exactly right here. I think pretty much everything she says in this chapter is true, and there's very little in it that I disagree with. I think it's a marvelous first chapter. There's a lot packed into it. So we'll start with that, where she sets up the terms for her aesthetics before she goes through to analyze the great works of the Western kin.